Okay, I think we're go.
Okay, good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday webinar series sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation, USA. We're glad you dropped in from wherever you are. And my name is Alan Jessen. I'll be your moderator today. You know, for the sake of our new guests who may be joining us, I'd like to say a few words about the Universal Peace Federation. UPF is an international and interreligious network of individuals and organizations, including representatives from religion, government, civil society, and the private sector, dedicated to achieving world peace. As an NGO in general consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, UPF supports the work of the United Nations, particularly in the areas of interfaith peace building, peace education, and strengthening of marriage and family. Our Tuesday webinar series are primarily focused on the divided Korea Peninsula. Each week, we have been hearing from experts in various fields with the hope to find that elusive roadmap for the eventual peaceful reunification of Korea. Today, we are taking a look at North Korea through an economic lens. So stay with us. I'm sure you'll get tremendous concepts that will help. The title of our discussion is really what's on people's mind, I think. What's the future? So the future of North Korea's economy: sustain, collapse, or transition. Command economies, by nature, are vulnerable to forces that may undermine the system and governing regimes. In theory, a partial reform toward marketization can lead to a disruption of the central planning function that coordinates the economy. For the DPRK, this is especially true of the monetary system, as one example. Informalization of a command economy may also lead to a destabilizing level of corruption and resource inefficiencies. This has been seen before during the collapse of the other centrally organized economies, such as the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So the world wonders, are these and other forces sufficient to pry open the door for North Korea to undergo a transition experience? And certainly, I think most casual observers do indeed wonder, how long can North Korea keep going down this path of isolation and militarization? If the political leaders don't want to change, which they don't seem to be interested in too quickly, can this endure indefinitely, or could economic conditions force a change? So that's the topic of our discussion today. We have a main presenter, and then we have Jim Edgerly to be comment and offer some questions. But I'm delighted to introduce our main presenter for today, Mr. William Brown. You can bring him on the screen for us. And Mr. Brown is a member of the board of directors of the Korea Economic Institute of America. He is the chair of the George Washington University's North Korea Economic Forum in the Institute of Korean Studies. And he writes and is interviewed as a North Korea expert for Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, the Wall Street Journal, and the Korea Times, Seoul's leading daily newspaper. He is currently president of Northeast Asia Economics Intelligence Advisory, LLC. His career as an economist and East Asia specialist has included extensive work in the CIA, Commerce Department, and the National Intelligence Council. He was raised in Gwangju, Korea by Presbyterian missionary parents who themselves were born and raised in China and Korea, respectively. So, Mr. Brown, we're delighted to have you back with us and share again on this important topic that we all are wondering about.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I love to talk about North Korea. I've got a little bit of a COVID residual, so if you bear with me. What I want to do today, maybe, well, I have a bunch of slides, and you know, I hate using slides in a way because it forces you to go down that track, and I like to just talk about things and discuss with everybody. So as I'm paging, and I won't go through all of them, it'll take all afternoon if I go through all of them. Maybe Jim and Alan, if you want to intervene at any point, ask a question, feel free to do that, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for both of y'all, I think, to discuss what I'm talking about. Here I teach a course. I've taught several courses at Georgetown and at GW on North Korea's economy. And every time I sort of redevelop the slide deck. I was working on this just over the weekend, and I decided to call it Trapped. North Korea's economic future, trapped. Maybe that kind of ducks the problem of forecasting, right? What's my crystal ball? But we can get at that. We can talk about where we think. Obviously, nobody knows what's going to happen with North Korea. Nobody knows what's going to happen with us, right? But we can discuss the forces at play that are sort of keeping it in line right now, and where it's changing. I think it's changing a lot, but not fast enough for the people or for us. So maybe go for the first page here. Call it Trapped Between Plan and Market, Implications for Stability. Quick theoretical, it's kind of theory. I don't want to dwell on the theory, but it is, I think, important to look at the theory of the command economy system that's still is the basis for the North Korean economy. It's still, in a way, a command economy system. Command economies, otherwise centrally planned economy, or a communist economy, however we want to talk about it. I always forget to go to give further reading, so let me do this right away. If you want to get more into this topic, I have a website, naeia.com. You can click on it, and it has all kinds of articles that I put in. I'll post these slides on it, in fact, this afternoon. A lot of what I look at is open source information on North Korea's trade with China. It's very current. China publishes a lot of data very currently. And also exchange rate data, a little bit of financial data is kind of what I focus on in that website. Also, KEI has a nice Peninsula blog website that you can look at. Stinson 38, they're great at looking at imagery, unclassified imagery, and looking at different things going on there. It's a really fun one to look at. For today's talk, I really want to give thanks to Kim Byung-yeon, a friend of mine, professor at Seoul National University. He wrote a book in English, Unveiling the North Korean Economic Collapse, a couple of years ago. A really great book. And I would encourage any of y'all to get it and read it. Kim is actually a specialist on the Soviet Union. He has his PhD on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so he writes that gives a really interesting North Korea perspective, looking back at what happened at the Soviet Union's, quote, collapse. And I think we can learn a lot from that. Jim Eggerly here also has worked a lot on East European reform, so that we can have an interesting discussion there too. I have there's a new book out, Chang Min-hwa, called North Korea's Political Economies, just published a couple months ago. And I have a chapter 2 called Kim Il-sung's Juche Economy, that I think, I don't want to sound like I'm proud, but I do like the piece. I do like it's about 20, 30 pages, but it goes through, I think it's a pretty good, it's not it's not path breaking. All this stuff has been looked at before, but I put together a storyline of what Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, went through in creating this, this crazy economy. I call it crazy, but actually I don't think Kim Il-sung, I don't think any of the Kims are crazy. I think they're actually pretty smart people, and they've been able to hang on longer than any other leaders. So you can't call them crazy, but the system is crazy, I think. And they've done a masterful job of holding it together. But what's really intriguing, looking at the history, like I've done in that chapter, is now, North Korea publishes very little economic data, almost none. In the past, in the 50s and 60s, they published a lot. And Kim Il-sung was a great speaker. He went out and spoke all the time, and all his speeches are written up in something called Korea Works, volumes and volumes of stuff that that has been translated into English. That plus the Woodrow Wilson Center archives here, Wilson Center, they have a great project called the Cold War something. But Cold War, what do they call it? The Cold War, they have a sort of a library of Cold War material. And it has, it got maybe 10, 15 years ago, it collected all the Soviet archives and East European archives of diplomatic traffic. Because in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of East European, Russian embassy activity in Pyongyang, and they were all giving aid and have all these aid projects. And of course, they write cables. So all their cables now are unclassified, and the Wilson Center has translated a lot of them into English. It is really fascinating looking back, seeing what the Russians and the East Germans, the Czechs, Polish, they were all talking about their aid projects in North Korea and the problems, the issues they were having with the North Korean regime, even then. They called it, for example, it was kind of like North Korea's getting out in front of them on their socialism. And they were saying, hey, wait, you don't need to, we didn't really mean you to do that. So it's really fun looking at it. Anyway, I've sort of encapsulated that in that chapter. Maybe keep going to next slide now. Yeah. Just a couple of sort of theoretical points. One is a socialist system like ours, but maybe even more, is focused on economic growth. Sometimes nowadays we think of socialism as being not so materialistic, but oh man, the whole system is extremely materialistic, trying to create economic growth. That's the whole focus of their, not the whole, but the main focus of their plans. So if we talk about GDP or production, economic production, it's kind of almost tautological, easy. How do you get GDP growth? Well, there are two things. One's obvious and one is a little more tricky. The obvious one is you get more GDP by having more inputs. Inputs of capital, labor, land, natural resources. Now, in the old days, in the classical economists like Adam Smith and Karl Marx, they boiled it all down to labor. Nowadays, we add capital, and some people put in land, natural resources, factors of production. But we usually use capital and labor as the factors of production. So if you raise capital, the amount of capital stock in your economy, if you raise the amount of work, you get GDP growth. Duh, it's kind of obvious. The less obvious one, though, is efficiency. People forget. It's also how well you use those factors, how well you use labor, how well you use capital. It's called total factor productivity, TFP. So together they create GDP growth, economic growth. Now capital is supplied, of course, by savings, but it's so important to think about how the savings become investment. The transition from a saving, you don't spend everything you earn. What happens to that extra? How does it find its way into investment? That's so important. And that's where it's very different between socialism and capitalism. In socialism, especially in Marxist socialism or Stalinist, you create a plan, an economic plan that forces the extra that you don't consume into investment. In a market system, the financial markets do that for you, for better or for worse. So you put it in the bank and the bank lends it to somebody who's going to build a factory. Two very different ways of taking the same problem, savings, and putting them into investment. So some interesting thing about the socialist or command system like North Korea's is they grow by investment. And the investment is determined by state planners. The savings are kind of forced. They just don't produce consumer products, so they produce a lot of capital goods, investment products. And so they build factories. They build a lot of factories. North Korea has a lot of factories all over the place. Now, markets and money tend to interfere with that planning process, so they try to get rid of it. But in getting rid of it, they have lots of problems with incentives. Incentives to do things better. Okay, that's a socialist. A capitalist system, you probably know, it grows by efficiency. Of course, it more work, more capital also, but it focuses on, because it's financial, and to borrow money and use it, you want to have an efficiency, you want to make a profit. It's really determined much more, which is determined by competition. It's very efficiency oriented. So you're more worried about how well you use the capital that you've got and the labor that you've got. Now, the big problem with capitalism is monopoly. Monopoly squashes competition, and also externalities, such as pollution, issues like that. And those require some kind of regulation. Now, they do in a socialist system as well. Okay, moving to the next slide, thanks. So another issue especially for North Korea, is something called the poverty trap. Maybe you've all heard of them. And again, it's kind of obvious. But if growth comes from savings, and savings then pours into investment, what if you consume everything you produce? You're at a subsistence level economy. There's no surplus with which to invest. And if you're focused on investment-led growth, there's no investment, there's no growth. In fact, you can go backwards because the investment that you have deteriorates, the stock of capital depreciates. So in that sense, if you're in a poverty trap, growth can only come from external sources of savings that are put into investment in your country, or some kind of efficiency change. Okay, so let's move to the next. This is why I call a poverty, trapped. North Korea is trapped, but let's look into it a little bit. This stylized systems, stylized just means I drew it, right? I made it up. There's no form, there's no equation that goes. I guess if I was better at math, I would write the equation. Maybe I used to be able to do that. But the style, I don't think some people will complain about it. Maybe you all will complain about it. I think most economists will agree with this. The important thing about this graphic is the horizontal line is not time. You know, we're used to putting time on it. It's not time. It's not a time dimension. It's a system dimension. So they're on the left, there's a command economy system. On the right, there's a private or market economy system. In the middle, this is what we're talking about with North Korea, a little bit with China, it's a mixed system. Now, my argument here, while in the command system, there's no money. It's amazing. Money doesn't work. It's all by dictate. You know, they command, the authorities command everything. They don't need money. People get paid by ration ticket. So I call it rule by ration. Now, in that command system, you do get a certain amount of efficiency, of productivity, because of all the investment that you do. I guess if you take the ends, the far left axis or the far right axis, what you really have is kind of some kind of chaos. No organization, no way for people to work with each other to build things. Instead, everybody has to do it, everything. The perfect juche, using Kim Il-sung's words, economy would be far to the left or far to the right. In a way, these two, you can pull them together. They kind of meet at the ends, at the extremes. But with the communist system, command system, they can, by the authorities, presuming they're smart, they know what they're doing, they can pull together a fair amount of capital together and create growth. Okay. On the right side of the scheme, I think everybody kind of acknowledges a market system does that much better. So you get much higher productivity in a market system. Problem is in the middle, what happens in the middle, and that's what we'll focus on today. Let's move to the, I had a good question there. What was the question from Jim?
No, we can get to the questions later, Bill.
Okay, yeah. So let's move. Okay, here, let's just look here where some other countries might lie. And these are just all, as I say, just made up. I just put them in. USSR in 1957. That's actually from Kim Byung-yeon's book. What I realized is, we think of Soviet Union as collapsing, a sudden collapse. Politically, it did, of course, but the economy was adjusting for a long time. And I think the peak of their command system was about 1957. It then started, because of poor efficiency, started to adjust. And as it adjusts, it started coming apart and went downhill until it broke up. Now, China, I would say that turning point was 78. See, in 78, China is very much of a command economy. Amazingly, by today, 2023, China has made it through that hoop somehow. And I have some theories on that. We can talk about that, how it made it through that bad times that a lot of the East Europeans and Russians faltered on. And then you can look at the US. I think maybe a lot of arguments, I'm sure, here, but I would say we peaked at about 2008 with the financial crisis, Lehman Brothers financial crisis. I think we've been going kind of backsliding ever since, moving away from the market, more toward a mixed economy. Okay, let's move to North Korea, though. Next slide. So I'm arguing North Korea is kind of caught in the middle of this, where its peak was about 1960. It's started making adjustments. It fell into a huge famine, and it's been sliding up and down ever back. So 2017, it seemed to be making some progress toward the market, but now it seems to be slipping back a little bit. Let's move to the next one. Next slide. Yeah, so here's what I call the double trap. This is really the huge problem for North Korea. So the poverty trap, as I said, it's a subsistence level economy that can't eke out any investment on its own. It can be a country, it can be a person, the same thing. You can't save anything. What are you going to do? You need some outside help. Maybe you need outside investment. You need something, or you need to do things better, efficiency, and climb that slope to the right. Now, in North Korea in the 1990s, it was falling into this transition trap. It fell below the poverty trap line, and there was a massive famine. Maybe 1 million people died for lack of food. Horrible, right? Well, I mean, Russia had a huge famine. China had a huge famine. All these socialist countries, except maybe Vietnam. I don't know if Vietnam had a famine. It has so much rice. But most socialist countries have had these huge, incredible world historical level famines. North Korea did in the 1990s, early in the mid 1990s. And it's been kind of washing around in this, what I call this double trap ever since. It can't get out of it. Now it's out of the poverty trap right now, but just barely, okay? So it needs something to happen. Now, if you're 2023, you're sitting there and you're a North Korean policymaker, it seems kind of obvious to us, you want to go to the right? Improve your efficiency. But a lot of those old people, a lot of the conservative people, it's a pretty conservative country, actually. They're dreaming of the back in the 60s when they had nice big steel mills. Oh, maybe we should go backwards to the command economy. So they keep washing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's what we've seen now for about 30 years. And it's very hard to predict. Remember, this is not a time thing. You like to say progress to the right. Well, no, not necessarily. It could slip the other direction. Okay, next slide. I'll try to speed up a little bit here. This is what we think we know. It's a very poor country, incredibly poor country, 26 million people, 27 billion. That's about 1,000 per capita, maybe 2,000 per capita. One of the poorest in the world. I like to tease the New York Times. People here think they know a lot more about North Korea than they do. Here in Washington, I mean, it's really quite absurd. But New York Times came out with an article, I think last year, 2 years ago. They said, GDP in North Korea per capita is $1,184.79. Honest to God, that's in their article on North Korea. It's totally absurd. I mean, the decimal points even, I say 1 to 2,000. But it's pretty clear in the last couple of years, they've had negative growth. Now, this year, 23, they might eke out some positive growth because their trade is resuming a little bit after the coronavirus shut them down. But malnutrition is prevalent everywhere, extreme poverty. And now reading the material just last few days, it looks like maybe there's some famine taking place, starvation taking place, even in Pyongyang. Very, very poor country. Next slide. Oh no, it's the other direction. Why is it so poor? Now, this is the trick, right? Why is North Korea poor? Well, it's just a poor country. No, it used to not be a poor country. It's not for lack of capital and resources or its culture. There's excellent natural resources, a lot of non-ferrous, with this electrification, everybody needs zinc and lead, all these rare earth. North Korea is full of them. They have one of the world's leading supply of zinc, and zinc is great for batteries, right? It's a high valued product. They've got a ton of it. I mean, I think they're the second largest reserves in the world, some of these. They've got a lot of hydropower, a lot of coal. Their population density for Asia is low. They've got a land per capita. Geography is great. By that, I mean, they're between, real estate is everything. They're between rich Japan, booming South Korea, booming China, and huge Russia, right? What a great neighborhood if you want to grow, if you're a real estate guy, right? Another thing not so obvious to people, they've got a lot of capital per person. Why? Well, because this system that creates capital, it creates factories all over the place. Plus the Japanese invested a lot there. Koreans built the stuff, but the Japanese provided money. There's a lot of industrial capital in North Korea. And maybe most important, they have a literate population for various reasons. Since the Japanese era, everybody knows how to read and write. That doesn't seem, for East Asia, it doesn't seem, or for Japan or South Korea, it doesn't seem so what. But if you look at other poor countries, the other, 100 poor countries in the world, they don't read and write. Latin America, the literacy rate in North Korea is way higher than Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, higher, right? So, but they get paid just very little, right? It's a very well-organized ancient civilization. So next slide. The answer is weak productivity. They just make horrible use of their ample physical and human assets. It's probably, I would guess, if you could measure it, it would be about the worst in the world. And there are two problems with it. One is this mixed system delivers very poor economic decisions. We'll talk about it a little bit. The mixed system causes, in the efficient system, market system, you have one price, the law of one price. And that's how you make decisions. You make profits based on one price. In the socialist system, there are no prices. There's no money. It's just dictated. But in that mixed system, you get a lot of different prices, which causes really weird decisions and a lot of corruption. It just doesn't work. Added to that, over time, with their all their problems, they've created basically foreign money is poured into the country, and they have essentially a partially dollarized economy. Amazingly, for a socialist economy, they use dollars, US dollars, and Chinese yuan, and North Korean won. The three of them circulate in tandem. We'll talk a little bit about that. But anyway, I argue they're trapped between these two systems. Okay, next. It's not always been this way. I think I mentioned this after World War II, right after 1945, my parents went to Korea. Well, they had been there. They'd grown up there. They went back after World War II. Korea was, it's easy to forget Korea was untouched by World War II. It's one of the few countries in the world that didn't have a World War II. It was in great shape. The Japanese was liberated from Japan. Japanese all left, all this industry, all these factories. Russians poured in. That was the problem. Absolutely, that was the problem. Russians poured into the north. They took over 1,400 factories. This is what you get from this diplomatic traffic. It's really fun to look at. And they're talking about all these factories they're taking over, North Korean factories, and they're just taking them. Some of the assets they take to Russia, or Soviet Union. Big hydro plant. They take the turbines, the biggest in Asia. They take the turbines back into Siberia, right? They ended up giving them back. Of course, the Korean War devastated them, but then huge amounts of aid poured in and built them back up. So they can't blame World War II for their problems. So when Kim Il-sung takes over right after World War II, North Korea is in great shape. By the time he dies, they're just on the cusp of a famine. Not a good story for Kim Il-sung. Okay, next. I think that's the golden age, 56 to 76. So important thing is this is what they think. So they look back to that age as kind of the golden 50s, and that's kind of a problem. 49, they had all industry socialized. By 56, all farms collectivized. Now, these were relatively easy to do because the Japanese left, vacant, the land, South capitalists, landlords. North Korea had about a lot of, it was partly tenant owned, partially private owned, partially big landlords. The big landlords all fled to the South because they knew what Stalin would do to them. So there's a lot of vacant land. It was easy to collectivize it. Same with industry. So by 56, it was a very socialized economy. This is what the Russians and Chinese are all saying. Wow, you socialized so fast. Unbelievable. There are a lot of criticism too, starting up especially by the Russians of what the North Koreans. They're saying they're spending too much on industry, not enough on farming, and nothing on consumption. The people are living horribly. How are they going to manage? That's just what Russians were saying about Koreans. Chinese were saying about Koreans. And then they tried to borrow a bunch of money. They've always been trying to get aid and investment. They defaulted. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. Please move to the next slide here. I love this little incident. Kim Il-sung goes to, I think, Shanghai in about 1960. He's always going to China looking for more aid, right? And he's having this conversation with Zhou Enlai. Y'all remember Zhou Enlai, the big premier of China, Mao Zedong's number 2 guy forever. Really important, Zhou Enlai. So Kim Il-sung is talking with Zhou Enlai, and Zhou says, it's kind of like, suppose they're up in Dandong on the border. He says, we noticed looking across the Yalu River that you never have to turn off your lights. You've developed socialism far faster than we have. Now, Kim Il-sung is probably a little nervous because he's there asking for aid, right? And so Kim says, yeah, but it's all with your help. We've done this. And then Joe says, yeah, well, we're helping you because you're holding down so many American troops. You're protecting the entire socialist world. That probably makes both of them a little nervous, right? Now, next slide is a picture. Yeah, this is y'all. I'm sure you've seen this picture. I was the first one to use it in a top secret document I produced for CIA back in 1988. It's not top secret anymore. But see, if you see the 2 little lights, I can't really point to them up there, right on Dandong. That's what Zhou Enlai is talking about. He's looking out over the river and seeing a brightly lit North Korea. Now, if you took that picture in 1960, that's what it would show. China would be black, North Korea would be white, South Korea would be kind of gray, black, Japan would look like it is now, right? Now, 30 years later, North Korea's gone black. That's sort of the amazing thing of that picture. It's not that North Korea doesn't have much electricity. It's that it used to have electricity, a lot of it, huge amount of it, hydropower. And by then and by now, there's no electricity for lights. Amazing the downturn in the economy, right? Okay, next picture. It's just a map, North Korea, just folks in the same area. A couple things to note though, how if you just look at North Korea rather than the whole peninsula, you notice how incredibly long that boundary is, border is with China. It's a very long border with China. And you also notice the two very long coastlines on the Yellow Sea, and this is an old map. America, the Koreans would complain, we call it the Sea of Japan. Now they like us to call it the East Sea. Why anybody else? I can see why they call it the East Sea. Why would anybody else want to call it the East Sea? Anyway.
Hey, Bill, do you want to kind of bring some conclusion to your remarks there about your, okay, thanks.
Yeah, let's move quickly. Next slide. Okay, so here's the command economy. I think we know what it means: ownership of capital by the state, no money, plan runs everything. The results, is a strong central state. The command economy delivers, since there's no money, the workers have no finance, no money. It's like they're slaves. Incredibly powerful way to control people. They don't have any money. They don't know where their food is coming from, except from their job, right? But there are all kinds of problems that it creates. I like to focus now on this. So we talk about supply chain nightmares here. That's par for the course in the command economy. They always have it. That's what Kim Il-sung was doing. All of these talks, he was complaining about supply chain. And I say, all these other command economies have fallen apart, except North Korea. Okay, so next slide. So market economy, I think we know what that is. The ones in yellow here are the ones I point to are the problem areas, the things really to watch on North Korea. This issue of the law of one price, they have incredible numbers of prices for the same thing. And it's absolutely corrupting their officials. The labor market they've made a lot of progress with goods and service markets, even real estate, but the labor markets is not there. That bodes very big concerns, stability concerns. Capital and finance markets are operating, but they're operating unregulated, and that creates a lot of potential trouble, as with the foreign exchange market. Okay, so those are sort of these vulnerabilities they've got in yellow there. Okay, next slide. These made a bunch of half steps. I won't go through them. Encourage foreign factory autonomy, rather, giving a lot of, it's very much like I think the Russians did in 1950s and 1960s leading up to perestroika. But they can't sort of push it all the way through. Kim has not pushed it all the way through, and for good reasons. He doesn't want people to have money. That gives them freedom. Money gives you freedom. You can buy the policeman. Next one. Maybe I'll just sort of go on the next one, move faster here. You can get a sense of what the wage issue is. Tremendous, huge problem in the state system. They get paid about 3,000, 5,000 won per month. Well, what is that? A cup of coffee in the market, really? But they get free, so many free perks, rations, free food, free housing, free everything. So maybe they don't need any money. Well, but if they want a cell phone, anything nice, they need money, a lot of money. And in the market system, which is the other half of the population, they get maybe 100 times that much, 300,000 won, but they don't get any rations. So two very different systems sitting on top of each other. And the arbitrage between them creates incredible dissatisfaction and corruption. Next, and inefficiency. Next. These are some indicators. Let me skip that. One thing they have done, Kim Jong-un has done an amazing job of stabilizing the yuan with these three currencies in everybody's pockets. Actually, dollarization helps get rid of inflation. That's what he did. He got rid of inflation, stabilized the yuan and the exchange rate. Next one, slide. This is, we can get a trade issues on trade. Of course, these sanctions, UN sanctions are huge. And then the coronavirus sanctions. So North Korea's exports, these are Chinese directions. So Chinese exports or North Korean imports, you see them falling to essentially nothing. The imports held up for a while. That led to a huge trade imbalance. That would cause an outflow of dollars. It didn't happen because I think Kim wisely instituted very tough monetary controls. So he's not printing any money. But that's caused, it's like high interest rates, very tight money, and fiscal discipline. You know, the Republicans here would love him because he's got balanced budget.
Thank you very much. Let's bring on. Do you have one final comments here before I bring Jim on?
Yeah, I'll go to the very last slide, or the next to the last slide. Oh, back next one. Okay. So if we talk about, well, the dangers there, I've talked about the dangers. The next slide here. Potential origins of instability. This is what I would call, I think number one on my list is financial panic, because we're seeing that already. Oh, this free market, people using money, borrowing money and lending it in different currencies. It's very dangerous. And we're seeing some instability, people getting very mad at each other because they don't know what kind of money they pay back in. Elite complaints. I think if there's trouble in North Korea, it's going to come from the elites, not the peasants. Firms can fail now because they've evolved a little bit, the reforms. And if a firm fails, what happens to the workers? Good question. There's no safety net. Labor unrest, but there's no labor unions like in Poland, so they can't organize. Military unrest. Military lives extremely badly, and you wonder why they don't get upset. Peasant revolt could come by withholding the grain supplies. Regional operate, the country is not, you can't move around very well, so far-flung regions, even though it's a small country, could pose a big problem. I don't think the population would blame Kim, because Kim is like God. It's kind of like the stability of the whole country. But they will, no doubt, blame second, third, lower levels, and the Workers' Party could get in trouble. Offsetting all that, there's no alternative leadership, and they're weak organizations. And they all worry of foreign interventions. They have a bad history of foreign interventions, Korean War being one, and they're afraid of foreigners, basically. So it's a huge problem. Okay, that's all I wanted to do.
All right. Well, good. Thank you, Bill. Shrink this. Well, let's bring up Jim Edgerly. I'd like to give him a chance to say a few thoughts what Bill has shared today. And introduce Jim. He's the founder of Higher Purpose Forum. And Jim has a 30-year track record of corporate development and value creation. As a lead investor and senior executive responsible for 3 successful companies, Jim was the founding partner, investor, and managing director of Biosolve Company, Orion Ropeworks, and the Industrial Restructuring Corporation. All 3 companies were developed and made profitable before being sold. He has a BA from Columbia University and MA from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sloan School of Management. Currently, he is the founder and director of the steering committee of the Higher Purpose Forum, which seeks to develop and disseminate perspectives on issues of public interest in the U.S. that convey universally shared values, mutual prosperity, and interdependence. Jim, thanks for coming on and sharing with us. We appreciate you have tremendous expertise, probably more in our economy than the North Korean economy, but the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Alan, very much. It's an honor to be invited to participate in this way. And I also thank Bill. I didn't know anybody knew this much about that secret economy up there in North Korea. It's such a mysterious place. There's no other economy like it. it's a very interesting topic, this issue of transition economies. There has been a lot of history since the late 80s of entire economies transitioning from command systems controlled by central political parties, into market systems. And there's been a whole different range of models that are now very well known. And I guess the model that we just heard about from Bill would call it is the stalled model.
Yeah, that's right.
These countries that cannot transition for the benefit of the welfare of their population because of political stubbornness. And another country that's just like this, but probably not as severe, is Cuba. Cuba's its transition is also, to my understanding, I'm not an expert, but I thought when Fidel Castro passed away that there would be a flood of investment into Cuba, and that has not happened. I participated personally for over a decade in the economic transition in Central Europe. And in Central Europe, it's a very different situation. And those countries made a decision, the ones that I was working in, to become westernized democracies. And they had almost like a revolutionary political change. They abandoned communism, one-party state, and established parliamentary systems. And they turned exclusively to the West, and all sorts of experts like myself came over there to help them with their transition. And there's no question, as Bill was saying, that these countries went through a trough. They went through a period of austerity, and there was a lot of pain. And I would say that the two things that really made a difference in these three things in those countries, which are not like North Korea, but very quickly, first of all, was a political decision to liberalize. Secondly, was their ability to integrate into Western Europe. The economies that were able to integrate into Western Europe grew extremely quickly, let's say like Poland or the Czech Republic, and more recently, Romania. And that's certainly an opportunity for North Korea. They are living in as it was mentioned by Bill, they're in the most dynamic economic part of the world right now. And the third thing that happened in Central Europe was that there had to be a change of generation, a generational change. And that Bill also brought up that the older guard, they really couldn't change their culture. And even during the privatization process, as long as these old dudes who grew up in the communist system remained in control, in a lot of places in the economy, not much changed. But now, 30 years later, you have those people have come and gone, and you have younger people, more educated, who weren't brainwashed in the prior system are now in control. And that's had a big effect on the success of that transition. So what happened in the countries of Central Europe is that you just as Bill mentioned, you develop a two-tier society. You develop the dollar economy, which is growing fast. It's very expensive. It's very competitive, requires a lot of education. And then you have the local currency economy, which is very stagnant. And those are more rural, older people, and the state-owned industries. And they separate very quickly. And people have a hard time transitioning out of the old economy and into the new unless they're very young. But of course, I think that the model that Bill is introducing in Korea, which is kind of interesting to think about Korea going into transition somehow or the other, is quite different than the one I'm familiar with. It's closer to the situation, I think, of China. And what happened in China, as I understand, is that after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping made economic growth a top priority for the planning and the governance of China, and the priorities of that country changed from political control to economic growth. And I think it seems to me from what we heard from Bill that it seems like he's hinting that the situation in Korea might be getting dire as it did in the 90s. So once again, the government needs to begin to prioritize economic growth rather than military strength and government control, because in China, really nothing happened economically until Deng took over, and that's when the rapid growth of China began. And I think there's other models. There's the Russian model of crony capitalism, which has proved to be a complete failure. The culture never transitioned. And there's the model of Germany, where you have Eastern Germany being integrated into Western Germany. And that happened very quickly and a very unique situation. And they move faster than any of these other transition economies. In fact, Angela Merkel, as I understand it, is an East German. So now they're running the country. But so that's very similar to what could happen in Korea. You've got this very wealthy and dynamic entrepreneurial economy in the South that could really transform North Korea quickly. But again, it comes down to the political will. So I'm not sure if the German model of national reintegration is the one that's relevant. I think the Chinese model of a growth-oriented mixed economy where you have a centralized government, which is allowing market growth to take place, is the one that perhaps is the most likely that we can hope for Korea. And I didn't realize some of the assets that Bill shared with us today, the issue of this very strong but probably aging industrial base, the fact that they have such a well-educated population, and the wealth of mineral resources. These are all of incredible interest to foreign investors. So it seems to me that the most relevant example of economic transition is the one right in their backyard of China. We always think of China as holding back the transition of North Korea, but perhaps there's also something that North Korea can learn from China. So those are my thoughts, Bill. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise.
All right, thank you, Jim. That's also added a good flavor to everything. So let's bring Bill back on. I just, I'm interested in the word used, trapped, because our headline said collapse, sustain, or transition, and you're saying trapped. So, we want to kind of know, is there a hope for finding a way out? Obviously, if they have the political will, there's a path, and we've learned through like Jim said, all the examples. There's a whole industry now of transition economists that have been thinking about this and preparing. This book, Mr. Kim, really went into a lot of what could happen with transition if it was engaged, and there's a lot to learn from that. It wouldn't have to be a big bang sudden thing. It could be a gradual, more orderly transition if it was sequenced properly. But I want to, in the book, I had a chance to look at that book, and their conclusion was that of their analysis, after they looked at the factors that caused some of the disintegration of the other economies, it says, our analysis predicts that the subtle balance between the power of the markets and that of the state cannot sustain long term, and that economic considerations will ultimately prevail among North Koreans. So he also raised the fact, Bill, that 70% of the income that people earn really come from the informal market structure, not from rations and things. So if that's true, it seems like there's no going back. There's only going forward. And wouldn't that put pressure ultimately on Kim to let go of his absolute power, or he might have trouble?
Yeah, those are all really, really good points. And especially comparing North Korea to Eastern Europe and China. I mean, of course, we've been trying to do that for years and years. I remember meeting with some Chinese in Beijing maybe 15 years ago, and I gave them a similar story on North Korea. And these were Chinese intelligence specialists on North Korea. I thought some of them were educated in North Korea, and they were speaking they started speaking in Chinese. Well, I know a little Chinese, and I understood what they were saying. They were saying, watch out, this guy knows something. So I kind of like that. But then I said, so in response to that, I said, why doesn't North Korea follow your path? You're such an obvious good path for them. And they kind of said, we ask that question all the time to ourselves. The key thing was land, get rid of the collectives. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping started the process in 5 years, got rid of the billion people get off of their collectives. They don't move, they just become family farmers instead of collectivized. That started their whole process. North Korea's never done that. They still have these dadgum collective farms that are incredibly inefficient. So I was asking then, I ask them now, why can't they get rid of these collective farms? And they said, we don't know. We just think they're better communists than we are. That was their answer. But the truth is somewhat, it's of course very complex. One thing about North Korea, I would say trapped. Well, trapped, why? Why are they trapped? Yeah, poverty trap, transition trap, but it may be more of a trapped by fear. You know, it's a small country, always deals with these monster countries. I mean, China is 20 times bigger than North Korea. North Korea is a small province compared to China. South Korea is now the 11th biggest economy in the world. Japan is huge. US is a monster. These are the 4 countries they deal with every day. They don't deal with anybody else, just these huge countries, powerful countries. Then they've reacted very badly. I'm not defending them. You know, they attack the South. They murder their own people. They can't talk to anybody. Why can't they're trying to develop nuclear weapons? What a stupid thing to do, right? But from their perspective, I think they're just scared to death of everybody. So there's a big problem for foreign investment coming in there. You know, I'm from the South. I think after Civil War, Southerners were afraid of Northerners coming in with money, bags of money, carpetbaggers, we called them. I think the North Koreans are afraid of carpetbaggers coming from South Korea. And especially the older ones, you know, why would you want your rich uncle, you know, come in and buy in your house? You know, you don't want that to happen. You want your own industry, your own country, your own culture. So, I mean, I think a lot of the support for the regime isn't regarding the economy at all. It's regarding the pride of the people, the stubbornness of the people. Push comes to shove, I think it will break down. And I think the finance is going to do that, because finance is so, everybody deals with money now, and that'll pull them apart. I think that's my guess.
Very good. I read where one of the driving forces of integration has been the historical feeling of the people that they want to reclaim their status as one country. That seems to be a natural for Korea, but there's with the South Korean people, is there any evidence that they would be willing to absorb the costs of integration?
See, I push back on this whole idea of cost of unification. A lot of people talk about the huge cost. If you look at the two countries, they are so complementary. They're not rivals, really. They're opposites, complementary. Trade between the two would have enormous benefits for both of them. Mm-hmm. And land, South Korea's population is declining a little bit, but it's very heavily populated. North Korea is not. Agriculture, minerals are on one side, they're not on the other side. It's just prime for cooperation between two different economies. That's what I like about Kim Byung-yeon. He talks about, and what Jim, you're talking about in Eastern Europe, the complementary nature of the East European and the West European economies. Complements, create enormous economic advantages, starting from nothing to integrated economy. So I really like the idea of integration. I dislike, come to think of it, I kind of dislike the idea of unification. Unification is just too tough. So I argue with the South Koreans, don't talk about unification. You're so far from being unified. You're two countries next to each other trade less than any other two countries in the world, right? It's the polar opposite of integration right now. So don't talk about unification. Unification is scary for everybody. It might happen, but don't talk about it. Talk about integration, where you can start developing at a micro level, company to company, people to people, businesses that make money on both sides. Don't talk about aid at all. They don't need aid. They need work. They need investment. They need a market for their stuff, their kimchi, whatever they're going to make. They have a good market in South Korea. So let's talk about integration. Let's not talk about aid. Let's talk about mutual benefit and integration, not unification. Maybe eventually unification, but I like the East European. I'm not a big fan of the EU, but for Korea, I am a big fan of the EU. I think an EU kind of integration project would be is the way to look. Not an East-West Germany unification. That is scary for Korea. It was scary for Germany. It's amazing it worked out. But then a couple other points. One is, don't forget, North and South Korea had a vicious war between each other. East-West Germany did not. A huge war that everybody thinks about. America's very involved. China is very involved. They haven't forgotten that. Their rulers don't let them forget about it. And then this other idea that communism for the Europeans and Chinese was taking over the property was a massacre, right? Chinese landlords were massacred. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Europe, same way. Russia, Soviet Union, horrendous pogroms to get rid of the capitalists. In Korea, that didn't happen. The Japanese, South Koreans left. So they don't have that huge anger against the communists that they do that the others. So those are things that sort of stabilize the system and have helped to keep it. But I think the main ingredient is fear. I think they're so fearful from their outside world.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. We're kind of reaching the end here. Jim, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us today?
Well, I kind of feel encouraged by this conversation to think about North Korea in the context of, transitioning. I've never, just the fact that we're having this conversation, to me, is kind of inspiring, but maybe that's just because Bill's an optimistic guy about the future. And I was also pleased to hear about all these assets, all these strong points that Bill mentioned, that I didn't understand the wealth of mineral resources and all the complementarities that exist. I mean, there's a lot of pluses in this story. And it is in the best region in the world. But his point about not talking about unification, that's disruptive to the way that unificationists tend to think. We kind of assume that everyone wants to unite, but you know something, I think he might be right. The status quo, to leave the status quo is very scary for people who are entrenched in the status quo. So you have to take it gradually, and you have to find a way for everyone to get a piece of the benefit going forward.
Yeah.
Leaving the status quo is scary as hell. I mean, I know that because when we were in Central Europe and we were trying to restructure factories and change the way they operated, most people weren't interested in that kind of change. They wanted to protect the little things that they did have. So, rapid changes, from my experience in poor economies, don't work. It's got to be done in a gradual, respectful process. I mean, we had so much violence in our factories from labor unions who didn't want the company to be privatized, which is the only way to save the company. But the workers themselves were against it. So this issue of not doing something so radical that people are going to be scared by it, like unification, that's a kind of an interesting suggestion that Bill gave us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, let me. That's a big point too in some of the recommendations that are out there, that it's harder to privatize an existing old company. It's better to open the way for more startup companies and smaller companies to build and grow. Then they naturally put a competitive pressure on the old ones. So that was one of the recommendations, if North Korea could open the way for more entrepreneurial activity.
Yeah, and that's really the China model in a big way. China has created so many new companies. Of course, they have these still old state enterprises that are corrupt, but their growth has been new companies.
Yeah. All right. Bill, one last final word, or are you, we thank you for your
No,
presence
I
today.
just like more and more I've thought about this unification business, but I don't want to sound like I don't want a unified Korea. Of course, we all want a unified Korea, but I think the key word for me is integration. Integration is a much better economic word than unification. It suggests a little bit of competition, a lot of I get better, you get better, we work together. Unification speaks to me of monopoly, and I worry about monopoly.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I guess to bring us to a close our Tuesday webinar. We appreciate Jim and Bill coming on today and sharing with us. And we meet every Tuesday at the same time on different topics. So please feel free to come back. This has been recorded, so it's available on our Facebook page, and maybe Roger can put that into the chat there for everybody. But you can find us out there if you'd like to follow some of the issues we've had over the last couple of years. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.